How is it that Lawrence Schiller seems to end up in the middle of some of the most interesting and controversial things that we know? Whether it is Gilmore's execution. You got close to Gilmore.
Right.
And you got Mailer to write the book.
Yes.
Oswald. Oswald's widow consulted you about, as the story goes, about medical treatment.
Correct.
What is it about Schiller, like a moth to flame, is there?
Lawrence Schiller is a man of many different faces and a man of many talents. Who is Lawrence Schiller? In 2002, Time magazine called Lawrence Schiller a world historical ambulance chaser, and I think that may be one of the better descriptions of him. But Lawrence Schiller could also be called a Hollywood deal maker, a fixer, a schlock auteur, having made a bunch of cheesy TV movies in the 70s and 80s and beyond, a packager, somebody who's collaborated with famous authors like Norman Mailer, and has also been a ghost author himself, somebody who is Zelig-like in his ability to recur over and over again in famous American tragedies and incidents of notoriety. Who is Lawrence Schiller? And what is Lawrence Schiller about? Schiller is maybe best known for authoring books about the O.J. Simpson case, American Tragedy, in 1996, and a book about the Jonbenet Ramsey murder, Perfect Town, in 1999, as well as his many collaborations with Norman Mailer, including The Executioner's Song and Oswald's Tale. Schiller was born in 1936 in Brooklyn and moved to San Diego at about 7 years old. He grew up with a father who was a photographer and who ran a photo store. And so in his early life, he was always always taking pictures, always had a camera, and was something of a whiz kid photographer, having pictures published in Life magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, and Playboy in the 1950s. In 1960, Lawrence Schiller covered the groundbreaking Nixon versus Kennedy presidential race and was a photographer who chronicled the Nixon campaign. And one of Lawrence Schiller's early indelible images captured Nixon and his wife Pat during Nixon's concession speech on election night in 1960, with Pat with a single tear running down her cheek. Lawrence Schiller also famously photographed Marilyn Monroe in the early 60s, including in 1962 on the set of Something's Gotta Give, one of Marilyn Monroe's last films. In 1963, on November 22nd, Lawrence Schiller was in the shower when his wife told him that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. As chronicled in Where Were You? America Remembers the JFK Assassination. Schiller, without saying another word to his wife, ran out the door, got on an airplane, and flew to Dallas in time to photograph Lee Harvey Oswald that weekend, and also to buy photographic rights 2 days later for the right to reprint the photos in the Saturday Evening Post when Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. In fact, Lawrence Schiller was in the basement of the Dallas police station on November 24th, 1963, and was present when Ruby shot Oswald. Thus began a long career of one of the chief purveyors of the official story in the JFK assassination. Lawrence Schiller, towards that end, published a book in 1967 called Scavengers and Critics of the Warren Commission that attacked the early critics of the Warren Report, including Mark Lane, Sylvia Marr, Penn Jones, and others. Also in 1967, Lawrence Schiller acted as Jack Ruby's business agent in securing the rights to Jack Ruby's final interview, where Ruby's brother, Earl Ruby, snuck a tape recorder into the hospital infamously to record Jack Ruby's final statement. This and other audio was published on the record The Controversy in 1967 by Capitol Records that Schiller produced. Schiller was also part of a CBS television special in 1967 hosted by Walter Cronkite, where CBS rebutted claims of a growing chorus of Warren Report critics who were attacking various types of evidence in the case, including the photographic evidence, which Schiller was instrumental in helping CBS rebut. In a brief clip that I'm going to show you here, Schiller analyzes the famous backyard photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald and authenticates the photo based on a recreation that Schiller made.
This photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald, which was found the day he was captured and disclaimed by him, has been used by numerous critics of the report. They say that the disparity of shadows, a straight nose shadow from the nose and an angle body shadow, proves without a doubt that this head was superimposed on this body. To properly recreate the picture to see if a straight nose shadow does correspond with a body shadow, you would have to go to the same address at the same day of the year and at the same time. We did that. This picture was taken on March 31st, 1967 at 214 Neely Street. And it shows without a doubt that a straight nose shadow corresponds with an angle body shadow. And that the fact that there is a disparity of shadows, that fact cannot be used to discredit the photograph.
Also during this era of the mid-60s, Schiller was involved in the Garrison investigation, where Jim Garrison in New Orleans attempted to prosecute Clay Shaw for being involved in the conspiracy to kill the president, John Kennedy. Lawrence Schiller's involvement in the Garrison trial was, like his involvement in a lot of famous cases to come, multifaceted. There are memos from a number of sources from this era that give us the contours of Lawrence Schiller's involvement in the Garrison case. Memos from Stephen Jaffe, Jim Garrison's chief investigator, who was trying to secure the participation of Laron Hall, who ran in the circles of anti-Castro Cubans who were said to be involved in the assassination. Schiller, according to the memo by Jaffe to Garrison of May 1968, had contacted Hall and was feeding Hall information about other witnesses in the case, attempting to scare Hall away from testifying. Schiller was trying to tell Hall that if he testified, he could get in trouble and get charged with contempt of court. We also have memos from the FBI from this era that have been subsequently declassified that paint a portrait of Schiller as an intelligence asset who contacted and was in turn contacted by agents in various branches of the FBI to trade information. Schiller fed the FBI information about, among other things, the source of a story that Mark Lane presented at the Warren Commission in 1964 about a meeting between Jack Ruby and J.D. Tippit a week before the assassination at Jack Ruby's club. What Schiller told the FBI was that the source for this story to Lane was a guy by the name of Paul Bridewell, and Schiller gave the FBI information about where they could find Bridewell, and failing that, other people that the FBI could contact to try to find Bridewell. And the reason why this story was interesting to the FBI and to the Warren Commission is because J.D. Tippit was the officer, the Dallas police officer that was killed by Oswald, supposedly about an hour after Oswald killed JFK. And Ruby wasn't supposed to know Tippit. And Ruby and Tippit also were in this story seen with a guy by the name of Bernard Weissman, who is a local John Birch Society member, a far-right guy who had sort of infamously published on the front page of the November 22nd, 1963 Dallas Morning News an advertisement facetiously welcoming Kennedy to town and asking him why he was betraying the country and committing treason and all sorts of other things. So the story, if true, would have made it a lot more unlikely that Oswald was a lone nut. It at least gave the impression that there may have been a larger conspiracy amongst the right-wing extreme in Dallas, who, were always the logical party to have been involved in the assassination. And we also know that the FBI didn't just brush Lawrence Schiller off when he was giving them this information about Paul Bridewell and who Mark Lane's source for this information was. The FBI, in fact, started an extensive investigation. When you read other subsequent declassified memos from the field offices to the director, trying to track down this Paul Bridewell guy through one of the people that Schiller mentioned as possibly knowing something, this guy named Thayer Waldo. The FBI actually tracked Waldo to Mexico, where they interviewed Waldo about Paul Bridewell and where he could possibly be. And so we have in the record memos from months after Schiller first contacted the FBI about this issue of Lane's informant, to where, they had taken his tip and run with it and spent a lot of time and resources trying to track down this tip. Another thing that's revealed by the memos of Stephen Jaffe, Jim Garrison's investigator, was that Garrison himself met with Lawrence Schiller when Garrison went out to Los Angeles in 1968 during his investigation. Schiller also struck up a personal friendship with Marina Oswald during this period and is said to have offered Marina Oswald advice on medical care, and Schiller and his wife also vacationed with Marina Oswald. This relationship later became important again for Lawrence Schiller and his participation in the Kennedy case, when in 1991 Lawrence Schiller and Norman Mailer went to Russia and then later to Minsk to interview people that Oswald had known over in Russia and to get access to the KGB files, which had just opened up after the fall of the Berlin Wall. After Mailer and Schiller had looked into Oswald's past in the Soviet Union, they returned to America, and Schiller negotiated with Marina Oswald to secure her participation as an interview subject for Norman Mailer's book, Oswald's Tale, that subsequently came out in 1995. If you notice a pattern in terms of Schiller's actions here, it's that Schiller, in each instance of his involvement in the case, constantly served to reaffirm the official story that Oswald was the lone killer. Schiller's involvement with Mailer in Oswald's Tale is an interesting story, and one that Schiller himself has spoken to a number of times. Schiller claims to have gained access to Oswald's KGB files through Ludmila Peresvetova, who was his translator for the Oswald's Tale project, and later his wife, when Schiller married her during his and Mailer's sojourn in Russia studying the released files of the KGB on Oswald's time in the Soviet Union. Of course, the question has been raised by others of whether or not Schiller would have to have been some form of intelligence asset to have gained access to these files. A number of researchers, including James D. Eugenio and John Judge, have claimed that Schiller was an intelligence agent vis-a-vis his participation in the Oswald's Tale project. John Judge: it's hard for me to imagine that Schiller was able to get those kind of documents based on his access to the KGB there, or some sort of salesmanship. I would think that in order to crack that nut, you'd have to have some links to current KGB and U.S. intelligence interconnections. And then after that, John Judge recounts how Schiller's history with the assassinations go back to at least the publication of his 1967 book, Scavengers. Also, in the premiere issue of Prevailing Winds, a review about Gerald Posner's Case Closed verges into discussion of Schiller and Mailer and their pursuit of the Oswald story at around the same time as Case Closed came out in the mid-90s. And the author touches on this other important aspect of Schiller's history with the FBI, in that while spying for the FBI in the Garrison case, Schiller contacted homosexual acquaintances of the defendant, Clay Shaw. These sources, 2 in San Francisco and 3 in New Orleans, all confirmed that Shaw used pseudonyms, including the name Clay Bertrand. Schiller and the FBI knew that Garrison was correct concerning a key disputed point in this case, yet they never made their knowledge public. And in fact, again in the documentary record, Schiller telling the FBI that he had checked his sources and was able to confirm with homosexual sources that he had cultivated through publishing an early article in Life about homosexuals in the 60s, had all confirmed that Clay Shaw was also known as Clay Bertrand. This fact that Schiller had apparently been able to confirm was never relayed to Garrison, the prosecutor of Clay Shaw. So the FBI was obviously withholding information from the Garrison investigation that would be useful. And so was Schiller, because as we know, Schiller met directly with Garrison through the notes of Jaffe, his investigator, and Garrison obviously would have mentioned a fact like the one that Schiller revealed to the FBI. So Schiller was acting obviously as some sort of double agent with reference to the Garrison case by meeting with Garrison on the one hand to supposedly help him with the case, but on the other hand feeding very important information to the FBI without in turn telling Garrison what he had discovered. One final note about Lawrence Schiller and his involvement in the JFK case is that after Lawrence Schiller and Norman Mailer had returned from Russia, having looked at the Oswald file in the mid-90s, and after the publication of Oswald's Tale in 1995, the Assassination Records Review Board was actually meeting during this same era, and in a March 4th, 1996 memo from Judge Tunheim to T.J. Gunn, director of the ARRB, Tunheim describes how he attempted to obtain the KGB file for the Records Review Board to be released to the public, and Schiller, after saying that he had thought long and hard about whether to make a copy of the Oswald KGB file available, decided not to. And when Tunheim tried to inquire as to why, Schiller's response was, "You just need to respect my reasons." And Tunheim also related that Schiller made it clear that he had the only copy and that Norman Mailer didn't have a copy, even though Tunheim says Mailer's name didn't come up. And Tunheim asked whether or not the Records Review Board should try to subpoena Mr. Schiller. And apparently the Assassination Records Review Board decided not to go through with hauling Lawrence Schiller in to see if they could get the KGB file for whatever reason. But Schiller had the opportunity through the Assassination Records Review Board to have the file evaluated by a board set up to evaluate whether or not sensitive files could be released to the public, and Schiller declined that opportunity, thus depriving the American reading public of potentially very interesting information about the Kennedy assassination, which has long been of interest to many people who research the case. You know, I know that I said I was done with the JFK case, but it just occurred to me as I was editing through this section that I had forgotten to mention that Lawrence Schiller was the producer of a 1977 TV movie called The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald that was a reimagining of Oswald's fate. In essence, the movie depicted a reality where Oswald hadn't gotten shot by Ruby 2 days after the assassination and had lived through a trial, and it depicted that trial and the evidence that would have been presented had Oswald gone to trial. And Oswald apparently dies right as the case is handed to the jury. Oswald dies. So a verdict is apparently not rendered in the movie. I haven't seen it. It's pretty obscure. But there are a couple interesting notes about the production of it that are floating out there online still. Richard Sprague, who is the first head of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the mid-70s, who was replaced by Robert Blakey, wrote an article in 1977, in November of 1977, about a number of different media events that were happening that year that were targeted at eliminating funding for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which at the end of the year was going to be up for funding. And so there was TV specials on a few different networks and a large ad buy associated with the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald in 1977. In fact, there was an ad that was placed in the TV guides that week, which contained a ballot for viewers to fill in and then mail to the television network to record their vote about whether or not they thought Oswald was guilty. So I just thought I'd add that one other little section about an interesting event that Schiller was involved in the history of the JFK assassination. So now I just want to go over pretty quickly the other things that Lawrence Schiller has been involved in his long and wide-ranging career. And I also just want to sort of, at the end of this, wrap up a couple thoughts about the life and times of Lawrence Schiller and why I think he's an important figure and what I think his career means. As I have briefly touched on, he wrote an early book about LSD in 1966 and photographed the Merry Pranksters for the cover of Life magazine, was interviewed by Tom Wolfe for the electric Kool-Aid acid test, and also photographed RFK's final campaign in 1968, and has said in interviews that he was at the Ambassador Hotel when RFK was killed. Schiller has also been a director and a producer of a number of films. He, in 1969, directed a portion of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Also directed a portion of Lady Sings the Blues in 1972. And in the early 70s was involved in a number of movie projects. In 1970, Lawrence Schiller obtained Susan Atkins' life story rights, and Atkins was also known as Sexy Sadie, a member of the Manson family, and published with Atkins a book called The Killing of Sharon Tate, and that later became relevant in the trial of Charles Manson And in fact, Lawrence Schiller was subpoenaed by Vincent Bugliosi to appear at that trial at the sentencing hearing for Manson to talk about whether the judge in the Manson case's gag order had been violated by the publication of Schiller's interview with Atkins. Schiller was also later the subject of a chapter of Vincent Bugliosi's book on the Manson trial, Helter Skelter, and was portrayed by Bugliosi as being a slick wheeler-dealer. Schiller himself comments on this episode by saying that the Atkins book, The Killing of Sharon Tate, was a journalistic mistake. During the same time period in the early 70s, Lawrence Schiller did a sort of a famous photo profile of Barbra Streisand and directed a couple of important documentaries, including The Man Who Skied Down Everest, which won the Academy Award for the Best Documentary, and the 1971 film American Dreamer, starring Dennis Hopper. It was a documentary about the making of Dennis Hopper's passion project, The Last Movie, which ended up being a pretty notorious flop. The last movie did anyway. And The American Dreamer is actually fairly high praise as a documentary, and it captures a sort of interesting, paranoid, downbeat era in Dennis Hopper's career after his first big failure, or I guess during. In 1974, Schiller collaborated on a biography of Lenny Bruce called Ladies and Gentlemen, Lenny Bruce, by buying the rights to Lenny Bruce's life story from his widow, Honey, shortly after Bruce died. And Honey, Bruce later sued Lawrence Schiller and received a settlement of $8,000 from Schiller by alleging that Schiller gave Honey money to fuel her heroin habit to induce her to sell extra rights of Lenny Bruce's life story. And in fact, Schiller had a big falling out with Albert Goldman, who was the author of the book and his collaborator in the Lenny Bruce project. It's just one of a number of former collaborators that later became enemies of Lawrence Schiller. In the same period of the mid-70s was when Lawrence Schiller first collaborated with Norman Mailer on a biography of Marilyn Monroe. And Mailer wrote the text of the book, and Schiller gathered a number of photographers who had taken photos of Monroe, including his own photos, and published and packaged the book. And during this collaboration, the first collaboration between Norman Mailer and Lawrence Schiller, Mailer and Schiller had a falling out based on Lawrence Schiller thinking that Norman Mailer hadn't done the research correctly on Marilyn Monroe because he didn't do his interviews through Schiller. And they collaborated on another book called The Faith of Graffiti in 1974, where Norman Mailer again wrote the text and Schiller packaged the book and did the pictures. But Schiller describes barely talking to Mailer throughout this period and only rekindling his friendship with Norman Mailer in 1975 when they saw each other at the airport on the way to the Thrilla in Manila, the seminal boxing match involving Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Again, during the mid-70s, Schiller collaborated with the great photojournalist W. Eugene Smith on another pictorial book called Minamata, which was about the mercury poisoning of Japanese farmers of that era. Also during this era of the mid-70s, again staying in this same period, Lawrence Schiller covered the trial of Patty Hearst in 1976, and then Schiller got on to one of the great collaborations that he was involved in when he became aware of the story of Gary Gilmore in 1976-77. Gilmore in Utah had murdered two men on 2 consecutive days, and then after he was arrested for the crimes, had tried to have a suicide pact with his teenage lover, a woman by the name of Nicole Barrett, which fell through. And then Gary Gilmore had insisted that all of his appeals be dropped and that he be executed. And Gilmore wanted to be executed by firing squad. At this point in the mid-70s, there hadn't been an execution in the United States for 10 years. There was a moratorium on the death penalty, and Gilmore's request was eventually granted, and he was put to death by firing squad, becoming the first man to die by the death penalty in the U.S. in a decade. This was famously turned into a book called The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer in 1979. And Norman Mailer won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, which was based on interviews that Lawrence Schiller had arranged with Gilmore. Schiller had outmaneuvered a number of more established writers, including David Susskind, to get the rights to Gilmore's story. In fact, Susskind was offering more money than Schiller was, but Schiller befriended Gary Gilmore's Uncle Vern and through a number of different machinations eventually outmaneuvered everybody to gain access to Gilmore for the story and for interviews with Gilmore, which were later used by Mailer in his book. In 1982, Lawrence Schiller directed the movie version of The Executioner's Song, starring Tommy Lee Jones, for which Jones would win an Emmy. In the mid-'80s, Schiller entered what was his Hollywood dealmaker apex. In 1985, he was the producer of a TV movie called Murder by Reason of Insanity, starring Candice Bergen. And then he would go on to be the main driving force of a miniseries set in Russia called Peter the Great that aired over 8 episodes and won 3 Emmys, including an Emmy for Schiller for Best Miniseries. In 1987, Schiller was a delegate to the Moscow Peace Forum, where Gorbachev announced perestroika in the opening up of Russia in what was to become the first real sign of the decline of the Soviet Empire. In 1989, Schiller directed Farrah Fawcett in yet another TV movie called Double Exposure, the story of Margaret Bourke-White. Bourke-White being one of the first prominent female photographers and the first female photographer to work for Life magazine in the 30s. And so then in 1990, he was the director of, again, a TV movie called The Plot to Kill Hitler that was based on a real-life event that happened in 1944 where some members of Hitler's inner circle tried to assassinate Hitler using a bomb, but were unsuccessful. And then, using his connections that he had gained during the making of the miniseries Peter the Great in Russia, and also through his connection with Ludmilla, his former and future ex-wife, Schiller got access to the KGB files of Oswald, as we had previously talked about, and began researching Oswald's tale. Then the late period of Schiller's career is among the more interesting, and Schiller's still around. He just turned 81 years old at the end of last month, and he is still active in making and producing TV projects and whatnot. But in 1996, a little bit before that actually, Schiller became involved in the O.J. Simpson case. Schiller ghost wrote the book I Want to Tell You, which O.J. Simpson released while he was awaiting trial for the murders of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman. The book reprinted various letters that O.J. Simpson had received of support while he was awaiting trial, and the book also responded in O.J.'s own voice to these letters. And the book ended up being very financially successful, earning millions of dollars, which helped in a big way in terms of funding O.J.'s defense. Schiller was also indispensable in the O.J. Simpson trial in editing the Furman tapes. And if you watch the interview that Schiller did with Charlie Rose after the O.J. trial, he touches on this a little bit, but what Schiller was able to do was to take 10 years plus worth of tapes that Laura Hart McKinney had recorded with Mark Furman for a screenplay that McKinney was writing about women in the LAPD. And over 10 years, from I think 1985 to 1994 or so, McKinney had interviewed Furman on background for this screenwriting project she was doing. In the process of all these interviews, Furman told her all sorts of stories about his experiences in the LAPD, including a lot of different references to police brutality that he had participated in, racial profiling. These are also the tapes where Furman had used the racial epithets that became a prominent feature of the trial on cross-examination with F. Lee Bailey, and that essentially discredited Furman and caused Furman to be charged with perjury. Schiller, again, was the one who was able to edit these tapes and unlock their value as evidence. And Schiller contributed this great service to the OJ defense team pro bono in exchange for access, in exchange for them looking kindly on him with granting Schiller access to defense meetings, and Schiller, as is his trademark, had sources in many different places of the OJ case, including the prosecutor's office and local law enforcement, including the LAPD. But some of his most important sources definitely was inside the defense team of O.J. Simpson. As a result of all of his various machinations in the O.J. case, in 1996, Lawrence Schiller published American Tragedy, which is to this day stands as the best book published about the O.J. Simpson case and the most exhaustive account of the actual defense of O.J. Simpson at trial. Schiller moved from one giant media controversy involving a murder to the next in investigating the Jonbenet Ramsey case in Colorado that happened over Christmas 1996, and again cultivating sources in the prosecutor's office, in the defense attorney's offices, in law enforcement, in the tabloids that ended up covering the case. In 1999, publishing Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, which is again one of the Bibles of the Jonbenet Ramsey case, one of the best books written, and certainly the best and most exhaustive contemporaneous account of the grand jury investigation and the first few years of the law enforcement investigation into that case. The still unsolved case of the Jonbenet Ramsey murder. And so again, as part of his trademark way of operating, Schiller likes to take books that he's been involved in and then repackage them. And so in 2000, Schiller was the director, writer, producer of TV movies based on each of his last two projects, American Tragedy and Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Both had TV movies come out in the year 2000 that Schiller was the main mover in terms of the creative development. A couple later projects of interest that Schiller has been involved in the last 15 years. In 2002, Schiller was involved in producing Master Spy, the story of Robert Hansen, which I've watched about the first half of and is an awful, awful movie, but a very interesting story based on a very interesting story, where in the early part of 2001, Robert Hansen, who is a part of the FBI brass, a high-up official in the FBI, was arrested after it was revealed that he had been passing secrets to the Soviets and then later the Russians for since the late 70s for over 20 years. Hansen was one of the biggest double agents ever uncovered in U.S. intelligence circles. Again, Schiller and Mailer collaborated on the research for this project, going over to Russia again to talk with people who had been contacts of Hansen. In 2004, Schiller produces a series called Trace Evidence based on the case files of Dr. Henry Lee, who is the forensic expert in both the O.J. Simpson and the Jonbenet case. In 2008, Schiller became involved with Norman Mailer's writers' colony in Provincetown. After Mailer passed away, Schiller became the director of Mailer's writers' colony. And in 2011, Schiller published a book called Marilyn and Me, which is supposedly one chapter of his as yet unpublished autobiography about his experiences with Marilyn Monroe and his photographs. And Schiller has said over the years in a number of different references and interviews that he is working on an autobiography. And in fact, I emailed him myself about a year ago to inquire if he was still planning on releasing it. And he emailed me back very briefly to say that he had planned to release it in 2018. And I haven't heard any further update. But he has said in some interviews that he plans on his autobiography or his biography being released after he dies. Again, Schiller is 81 years old, so he's getting up there in age, but he's still definitely around and kicking. If you look at his Schiller's IMDb page, you'll notice that he is definitely still active. In 2017, he's the producer, listed as the executive producer of Gary Gilmore, Dead Man Talking, yet another TV movie that he's involved in. And in the last couple years, he has been the executive producer of 3 projects, 2 OJ documentaries, OJ Speaks, The Hidden Tapes, in 2015, and also in 2015, The Secret Tapes of the OJ Case, The Untold Story, both TV movie documentaries. And in 2016, he's listed as the executive producer of Overkill, The Unsolved Murder of Jonbenet Ramsey. You may be saying to yourself, I can understand why intelligence agencies would be interested in the JFK case, which Schiller was involved in various ways for over 30 years. But what may be a little bit more puzzling to the average person listening to this is why the intelligence agencies would care about being involved in stuff like the O.J. Simpson case or the Jonbenet Ramsey case. And it is totally possible that Schiller, being a multifaceted guy, isn't always in bed with the intelligence agencies. But one thing I can tell you is, having read a decent amount about the activities of the intelligence agencies in this country, and especially their activity since the Cold War era, there really isn't too many areas of life that fall outside of the purview of an agency like the CIA or the FBI. In fact, in the notes for this program, I'll link some interesting articles for further reading about revelations that the CIA was involved with disparate projects like promoting modern art in the 50s and 60s, in founding the Paris Review, which was a literary review magazine, which still exists, a very high reputation, a highbrow literary review journal that was founded as cover for various writers during the 50s and 60s at the height of the Cold War. And I can also tell you that an incident like the O.J. Simpson case, as clear-cut as it may seem, looking at it from the perspective of somebody that only sort of knows the official line on it, it may be hard to see why that would be of interest to an intelligence agency, but one comment that I would make in response to that is the OJ case was of enormous influence in terms of the way that it shaped the next 20 plus years of the direction of American society. It single-handedly was responsible for stuff like Court TV being formed. It massively distracted the American public to where there's millions of people that spent much of their time during the period when the OJ case was at its apex, just watching and analyzing and digesting and talking about the case. And so, looked at from that type of perspective, it can maybe be a little bit more self-evident why the government would be interested in having contacts with people who were intimately involved in big media sensations like the O.J. case or the Jonbenet case. In fact, one person that goes into a lot of interesting, I guess you could call them conspiracy theories, or just sort of interesting off-the-wall analyses of government involvement in these types of cases, like the Jonbenet case and the O.J. case, is the author Stephen Singular. In his books, Presumed Guilty, about the Jonbenet Ramsey case, and Legacy of Deception, about the O.J. Simpson case. There's some interesting future reading from a good alternative history author. A couple of interesting things to ponder there about Lawrence Schiller and his life and times. There's been a lot of resources that indicate that Schiller is or was some kind of intelligence asset, and I think that much is established. The question is, was he more than just an asset? Was he a spy? And I'll leave you with this clip that I found on YouTube, where Schiller talks about his involvement in trading spies between governments. And I'll just before I put this clip on and end this piece, I just would like you to contemplate if the government would just contact somebody that they couldn't trust to be involved in something as sensitive as a spy deal, where they trade a captured spy for another captured spy between the U.S. and the Russian government, for example. And I'll also just note that Schiller indicates that one of the incidents where he was involved in trading spies was during the Obama administration, so very recently. Anyway, thanks for listening. I appreciate your time and consideration, and I hope this finds you well.
But to me, I want it to be my voice. And I want the warts on my face to show. I want to show the imperfections in my own development and the mistakes that I made and the enemies that I crossed with. Because if I'm more honest about myself, then what I write about has a greater ring of truth. I mean, in my autobiography, you'll read that twice in my life I was involved in trading spies, involved in trading an East German for a Russian, and recently when Obama was trading spies, I knew one of the spies that was in jail that was brought back from 20 years earlier, and his wife, he insisted that I go to Russia and bring his wife and children out, that she wouldn't go out with anybody else, because it wasn't that he trusted me, I guess he was gambling with me.